Hello, welcome everyone to the debate for State Assembly District 17. My name is Nick Ferris. I am the treasurer of the Telegraph Hill Dwellers. This is a special follow-up debate to the election held on February 15th. Since neither candidate received 50% plus one of the votes, we are having a special runoff election between the top two candidates. So we are joined by David Campos and Matt Haney. This special election will be held on Tuesday, April 19th. Now, this debate, as they all do, took an incredible amount of work. I just want to very quickly thank all of the co-sponsoring organizations. You can see some of the people behind me. Just some quick shout outs, though, to the Barbary Coast Neighborhood Association, North Beach Business Association, Next Village SF, Russian Hill Neighbors, Lower Polk Neighbors, the Coalition for San Francisco Neighborhoods, District 3 Democratic Club, Rincon Point Neighborhoods Association, East Mission Improvement Association, and the Telegraph Hill Dwellers. If you're not a member of any of these groups, please join whoever is most relevant for you. All right, now the agenda for today. We're going to start with 90-second candidate introductions. Then we're going to move to 4 moderated questions. These questions were submitted by the sponsoring organizations, and Joe's going to lead those. After that, we'll move to candidate questions. So each candidate will have 2 separate opportunities to ask the other candidate a question. After this, we'll move to audience Q&A and then wrap up with 90-second closing remarks. So a very similar structure to what we did last time for folks that remember. For the audience question portion, please submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. When you submit, our team will then review the questions submitted, the questions that were submitted in advance, as well as what's being submitted live here. And we'll share those audience questions with our moderator, Joe, to ask each candidate. And I would just say a reminder, when writing these questions, please try and do so in a way that every candidate can respond, and also in a way that's applicable to a state assembly member. Rules for the debate, very simple. Candidates have 2 minutes to answer each question. In our last debate, we only had 90 seconds, but since there are just 2 candidates now, we hope we can go into some more detail. Every round, candidates will have the opportunity for 1 30-second rebuttal, and we'll be rotating each round with who begins first. So for the portion where a candidate asks another candidate a question, they'll have 30 seconds to ask that question, and then again, another 2 minutes for the response. I'll be keeping track of time and showing time cards when 30 seconds remain, 10 seconds, and then when it's over, I'll hold up a stop sign. So candidates, please ensure you can see my screen. And now, on that note, I'd like to introduce our esteemed moderator for the evening, Joe Fitzgerald Rodriguez. Joe is a San Francisco native, an Outer Mission resident, and longtime city reporter covering local politics. While now he's at KQED, his bylines were also seen in the San Francisco Examiner, SF Weekly, and San Francisco Bay Guardian. Before you ask, he went to Wallenberg and Soda high schools. On a personal note, Joe and I just met for the first time through this event and quickly found mutual friends and classmates. They'll love the San Francisco high school connection. And on that note, it's over to you, Joe.
All right. Well, hey, thank you for having me, all of you wonderful associations. And remember, candidates, we have, just to go over the rules one more time very quick, you have 2 minutes to answer these questions, 1 30-second rebuttal. I'm going to really hold you to it. Please don't go over. But you guys are pros at this. You should be fine. So our first questions come from the sponsoring groups themselves. And we're going to start with some recent news.
And actually, we're just going to start off again with a 90-second candidate introduction.
That's right. So each of you have 90 seconds for this. Go for it. Matt Haney, please start.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Joe. Joe just wanted to get right into the questions there.
I was so ready.
And thank you, Nick, and good to see you, David. Thank you so much to all of the sponsoring organizations for hosting another debate. I know we had one during the first round as well. So I'm really grateful that you all brought us together for another one. I'm running because we have some very tough challenges in our city and our state. We need to build more housing. The cost of housing is out of reach for far too many people. We have thousands of people who live on our streets, and yet the state doesn't have a plan or accountability to make sure everyone does their part. We are closing down mental hospitals at the state level when we need to be opening them aggressively. And we have to recover in a way that for our neighborhoods and our small businesses, that they are given the support and investments that they require. These are issues that I've been on the front lines on. I represent District 6 right down the street from many of the neighborhoods that were named there. I've been on the front lines of building more housing, of getting thousands of people off the streets, of authoring mental health SF. I chaired our Budget and Finance Committee through COVID. I've spent 15 years in public service here in San Francisco fighting and delivering on these issues. And what I know is that we need leadership that can bring people together, that's proven, that's effective, and that really ensures that the state gives us the support that we need, and that ensures that everywhere in the state, every city and county does their part on these challenges. Looking forward to the questions, and thank you again.
Thank you, Matt. All right, David, please.
Thank you very much. Again, Nick, to Telegraph Hill dwellers and all of the organizations, and to you, Joe. It's good to see you, Matt. I'll be honest, this election is not about me or Matt. From my perspective, this election is about the need to change a system, a political system that is broken. And this system is broken because the way that it works is that you have politicians who say the right things, who look good, who sound good, and when they get elected, they don't do good. And they don't do good because of the way that campaigns are funded. And that's why our campaign is about changing the way we elect officials. We are running a corporate-free campaign because we believe that the changes that are needed, whether it's Medicare for all, whether it's Green New Deal, housing that is affordable, all of those changes are not happening because of the way politicians run. They run with money that is against that change. And I'll take the most important issue that I think facing our city and our state, which is Medicare for all. Even in that issue, someone like Matt Haney says he's for Medicare for all, the way other politicians have said it, but he's taking money from the very people that are against Medicare for all. And I think what's going to happen when he gets elected, if he gets elected, is that he's not going to deliver on that promise. That's why we're trying to do it differently. We are corporate free so that we, when we're elected, we're beholden to no one other than the voter. That's what this campaign is about, and I hope you join us in this effort to change our system.
David, thank you very much, David. Really appreciate it. All right, that's it for our introductions. And our next portion is our 4 moderated questions. These questions, as I said before, when I jumped the gun, my apologies, come from our sponsoring groups. And the first one is right out of the news, care courts with Governor Gavin Newsom. So the critics of the care courts that Governor Gavin Newsom has proposed have said there aren't enough services attached to the plan, including a lack of psychiatric beds at every level, including locked facilities, making it hard for people who want help and those who don't get the help they need. Why do you support a plan, and both of you have publicly supported this plan, that lacks some key services? And what can you do at the state level to expand bed capacity at the highest levels of care? And if you have time, to people who argue it's a violation of civil rights, why do you support conservatorship, which is a part of this plan? David Campos, let's start with you. You're muted, David. Let's reset the clock.
Okay, sorry about that. I support the plan not because it's perfect. There are clearly gaps in the plan, and one of them is the fact that we need more programs and more services connected to the plan. But I do believe that something needs to be done and that the status quo is not working. And quite frankly, one of the reasons that I'm running is because I have the most experience of anyone running in this office and actually in the state in dealing with the issues around homelessness, mental health. I'm the person who created the First Navigation Center. I'm the one who proposed safe injection sites. And I think that the reason why the main author of mental health SF is supporting me is because I have the experience, having been an administrator in Santa Clara County, to implement the programs that are needed. And in terms of conservatorships and some of the issues around that, I know that that is a tough issue for many, but what I would say is that I think that there are ways in which you can have protections that ensure that the rights of individuals are addressed and are taken care of, but still address the needs of some individuals. And sadly, there are some individuals that unfortunately cannot decide for themselves. But the bottom line is that when it comes to homelessness, when it comes to mental health, the status quo is not changing. If you want the status quo, if you're happy with what is happening in District 6 and neighborhoods like the Tenderloin, if you're happy with what's happening in the city, you should not vote for me. But if you want a new approach that actually, pushes for innovation, that has the state play a leading role in creating these programs and providing the resources that local jurisdictions like San Francisco need, then I hope you give me that chance, because I have shown at the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco as a deputy county administrator in Santa Clara how to address the issue of homelessness in an effective way that is also humane. That's what I think is needed, and that's what I bring to the table.
Right. Matt Haney, please, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I definitely agree the status quo is failing. The first thing that I worked on when I got into the Board of Supervisors was challenging our dysfunctional, broken mental health and behavioral health system. I co-authored Mental Health SF, which really was to fix a system that was around for a long time, including for the 8 years when Supervisor Campos was in power and didn't seem to do much to fix it then. We took it on when I came onto the Board of Supervisors to actually create a system that had coordinated care, that ensured we had street crisis response teams rather than the police sent out when somebody's in crisis on the street, an office of coordinated care so that they didn't just go in and fall through the cracks by design. People were overwhelmingly going into emergency rooms and walking out in their hospital clothes with no connections. And what we found when we built Mental Health SF is part of the problem is that the state system and the state laws are broken. There are far too many people who we can't help here because you ask a firefighter, you ask a paramedic, you ask an ER doc, there's no power that they have to help that person once they walk outside of their doors. And we have to be smarter about how we think about the tools that are available. And I think that the care courts can provide us with that. If somebody is out there every day using fentanyl, out there every day with a deep mental illness and unable to make decisions to protect themselves, we need to bring that person in a place like a care court where they have access to beds. And yes, I agree, we have to invest a lot more in treatment beds. One of the problems we have here with Mental Health SF is people wait for years to actually be sent to a bed. And many of those are state beds. So we do need to increase the investments. But in a care court, an environment where there are more legal tools, more ways to bring people in who are a danger to themselves or others, I think we can do much better than we're doing now. And there has to be more accountability so that the state is doing more and we're not doing this ourselves.
All right, Matt. Thank you. All right, do we have any?
Rebuttal?
Yeah, you're going for a rebuttal? All right, you've got 30 seconds, David.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. And I think that for those of you who are watching, the difference between me and my opponent, I mean, the reality is the difference between a show horse and a workhorse. And the reason why I think that Matt Haney's, most of his colleagues are supporting me is because they see me as someone who actually doesn't just talk, actually does the work. And mental health is the perfect illustration of that. The main author of that bill that you co-sponsor is supporting me because she knows that I'm the person who's actually going to make it happen and get it done if I'm in the state assembly.
All right, David, thank you. Matt, did you want a rebuttal?
Well, he's saying he's running against the status quo, but he's saying that also that the majority of supervisors are supporting him. He's been around for a very long time, I think elected to office 20 years ago first. So yes, he has long relationships, but that's not what's going to decide this. It's going to be decided by the voters and who's going to be the most effective and strongest to take these problems on. And I took on our mental health system. I passed an entire revamp with Hillary Ronen, who yes, has a close relationship with him as well, to fix this. And he had 8 years to do something similar and he did not.
All right, Matt, thank you. All right, moving on to a definitely not less contentious topic, housing. A contentious project that was recently shot down. 469 Stevenson Street was the location of a proposed 495 unit apartment complex that was rejected by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. When you both have spoken about this project and housing in general, David, you talk about a need to build less luxury housing and more affordable housing, as you put it. And Matt, you talk about the need for more market rate housing to help everyone. But to each candidate, why is your approach the best for San Francisco? And is the state intervening enough right now? to compel the type of housing construction that you're talking about. David, I believe we started with you last time, so Matt, go for it.
Sure. We have to build with our own housing element. We've already laid out 80,000 units over the next 8 years. And so building on valet parking lots with high levels of affordability, with community support, union jobs is something we have to be able to do. This was a project that has a signed community benefit agreement with 12 organizations in the neighborhood. They agreed to an incredible community benefits agreement. 24% affordable was what this project would result in, which is the highest level of affordability on an entirely private land residential project that we've seen in San Francisco in a long time. So this was a good project. It was privately developed. There are going to have to be some projects that are privately developed. It would have contributed in a positive way to what is now still a vacant valet parking lot. And I think it is really shameful that it was not built. Those are 500 units of housing that we should have that we don't, including over 100 units of affordable housing for families. And so, yes, I would have supported that, but we can't only build projects like that. We need projects like that, and we need smaller projects to be built as well. And we need a much greater investment in social housing and affordable housing. I passed an increase in the jobs housing linkage fee, which is going to bring hundreds of millions of dollars into our city to build housing for workers. We know that the market cannot do this alone. We have to invest in affordable housing. The state has to do statewide bonds, has to develop a social housing, allow for regional bonds if we're going to meet our affordability goals. But as a part of that, we have to be able to build projects like 469 Stevenson. And I think people around our city are looking at this going, if our board of supervisors is going to get in the way and folks like David are going to oppose projects like this, how are we ever going to meet our housing shortage and the housing goals that we have in both affordable and market rate units?
Thank you, Matt. David.
A couple of things. Stevenson was not a good project. Contrary to what Matt is saying, the fact is that only 14.7% of the units were affordable on site, and only 6% of those units were actually available for low-income residents. So the idea that less than 15% affordability is a good project, I'm sorry, I don't think that we're going to create housing that meets the needs of regular San Franciscans, middle class, low income San Franciscans, if that's all we do. But the interesting thing is that Matt Haney voted for a similar project against a similar project just a week ago. So the Matt Haney who's talking today is not the Matt Haney who got elected D6 supervisor. And it's not an evolution, it's an about face within a matter of days. And you know what changed? It goes back to the system, this broken system. What changed is money. You have developers that have contributed close to $500,000 to make sure that Matt Haney is elected to the state assembly. That's what's changed. And so he went from being the supervisor who said, when I become D6 supervisor, I'm going to push developers to build more affordable housing, to now simply saying, let developers build whatever they want. I want housing. I don't want a parking lot in that lot, but I do want housing that's affordable for the people who live in that neighborhood. And only 14.7% of those units being affordable to me is not enough. We need housing that our teachers can live in. We need housing that our restaurant workers can live in. And the reason why Matt Haney no longer says that is because the close to $500,000 that he has received in contributions, that's the difference. And I am going to go to Sacramento to make sure that we build more housing, but that it's truly affordable without simply giving developers the blank check that has been given in D6 today.
All right, Matt, I'm going to imagine you want to rebut that, but let me at least focus it into three things. We heard that the Stevenson project did not have the right mix of housing. We heard that you took a different vote, and it would be appreciative to hear that. And then there was an allegation around funding you took. Feel free to tackle all those if you can, or 30 seconds.
Sure. Well, the other 10% of affordable units were offsite. That's very common. David has supported many times offsite in lieu fees, including what is going to get us an 100% affordable project in Monster in the Mission, where that site was, is being built entirely by in lieu fees from my district. So it's very common to do some on-site and some off-site. I've been consistent around housing. I'm for building more housing. We've built more of it in my district than any other. We've had great also investments in affordable housing. If you go around my district, there's supportive housing, there's affordable housing being built at a scale much higher than David ever built. So we're doing both, and I've been consistent around that. And even the logic of the contributions and thing doesn't even really make sense.
All right, Matt. Thank you. Thank you. David, did you want to, you can have time for one more rebuttal, but if you would like to yield that 30 seconds, I'd be interested to hear Mr. Haney's explanation of that vote you stabbed him with. I'm sorry. What'd you say, David?
I actually talked about that other project in my comments on voting on 469, which is the other project had no units for families, had under 12%.
Oh, Matt. Sorry, David's asking first time. David, you have 30-second rebuttal.
No, I said that I would wait to use my rebuttal at a different time.
You wait to use your rebuttal at a different time. Okay, great. All right. In that case, we're going to move on. We've got another question here around housing. And, people are very interested, obviously, in dialing down on your philosophy. And this is what this question, with these series of questions, really get to the heart of. Do you support the use of the state density bonus law? Why or why not? And do you believe that building more housing supply is needed in order to lower prices for other folks who are buying housing that's lower on the ladder? The way that it's phrased here, and the reason I'm stepping over it a little bit, is they do phrase it as trickle-down economics. That is one way that this has been kind of levied as a critique. So they're asking if you believe in building more housing supply to lower prices across the board. And then would you in Sacramento restore local control, more local control to land use and zoning? And could you talk about why? David?
Thank you. Let me just make sure that I'm timing myself. Listen, I do believe that we need to build more supply of housing, of all kinds of housing, including market rate housing. But I also believe that the type of housing that you build is important. I don't believe that simply building more luxury housing is going to somehow trickle down to the benefit of low income and middle income San Franciscans. It hasn't worked. It won't work. I believe that we need to have more supply, but I believe that government has a role to play in pushing for the building of affordable housing. That's why I have proposed, the moment that I decided to run for this seat, I proposed a housing bond for the state at the state level that funds affordable housing. I don't believe that the market will fund and build affordable housing if left to its own devices. In this particular race, though, there is a very real difference in terms of the role that local control plays. I believe that housing has to be built, but that doesn't mean that we should not listen to communities and hear from communities about the kind of housing that is built in their particular neighborhoods. And people, if you look at the YIMBY position on this, is that any conversation, any discussion of community input somehow makes you a NIMBY. And I think that most San Franciscans are where I am. That's where I am, which is to say, we want to build more housing, but we need to empower neighborhoods to have a say over the kind of housing that is built. That is how we have gotten affordable units in places like the Mission and places like South of Market. In District 6, Supervisor Jane Kim, she had a history of getting 40%, even 50% affordability because of the role that community play. So I think that there is a way to balance both. That's the approach that I'm going to bring to Sacramento instead of simply giving.
All right, David, thank you. Thank you. Matt, 2 minutes.
Well,
do you need the question restated?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So they basically want to hear about your philosophy on supply and demand in housing. It has been characterized as trickle down economics. Is that the philosophy you describe to in terms of how housing should be approached in San Francisco and in the state? And would you restore some local control to in Sacramento?
Well, we do need to build more housing in San Francisco and around the state, and we need to build it in more neighborhoods and more cities and counties that aren't currently. We have one of the worst ratios as a state when you look across the country of people to homes, and we need to build more. That means both allowing for private developments where appropriate, having high levels of inclusionary and fees that allow us to ensure that there's affordability there, much more aggressive investments in affordable housing, subsidized housing, social housing, and making sure that more cities and counties are doing their part on housing. You know, there are some, you know, down the street in Woodside, they said that their entire city was a mountain lion preserve and didn't want to build any new housing. That's unacceptable. So there's of course a role for community input and neighborhood input, but there's not a role for that type of blocking of any type of housing or affordable housing. If you look at the housing pipeline in San Francisco, it is overwhelmingly in District 6 and District 10. And the result of that is that we are not building enough housing for our city's needs. So we are going to need to, with community input, with our housing element, develop plans that provide some level of upzoning around commercial corridors and ensuring that we work together to build housing throughout our city and to fund it with more public dollars and make sure cities and counties are held accountable to do their part. That will be the approach that I take. It definitely will be collaborative with neighborhoods, but it will be with the goal of building more housing, including meeting our goals around our housing element. Over 50% of the housing that we build over the next 8 years will have to be for low income, very low income, and middle income. And so making sure that we're doing that all over the city, making sure that we're funding it with public dollars and zoning for it is going to be key. And of course, neighborhood input will be a part of that.
All right, Matt, thank you. Real quick, Matt, what I didn't hear from you was an explicit yes or no. Should there be more local control restored to cities if you were in Sacramento?
Should there be more local control
around approval of housing? Yeah.
No, I think that local control, if you look at it across the state, has prevented housing from being built in many places, including apartment buildings and increasing density with density. So no, there's a role for input for sure, but I don't agree with that.
Thank you. All right. As none of you has directly challenged the other in your answers, I'm going to say that there's no rebuttal for this one. That is our criteria again for allowing a rebuttal. Moving on, another question ripped from the headlines, Uber and Lyft. San Francisco, as we've just seen, by the way, is discussing allowing the Uber and Lyft and taxis to have a partnership, as you could say. San Francisco has struggled for years, though, to argue for tighter regulations of Uber and Lyft to protect both exploited workers, the disability community, who have sued them quite a bit, I might add, safety of riders and people on the streets, and have largely failed due to the PUC's lighter touch to regulation. Will you, in Sacramento, support or propose legislation to take away PUC control or otherwise reform PUC control of TNCs, as they are called, Uber and Lyfts, and turn it over to municipalities? If not, what is your solution to regulation of Uber and Lyft and similar services? Would you, and then additionally, would you support state legislation to allow congestion pricing? Matt, let's start with you.
Yes, the current situation as it relates to regulating Uber and Lyft and similar services is completely unacceptable. The ways in which we are prohibited from local regulations is really just shameful, and it got much worse with Prop 22. I was very involved in working with folks and fighting against Prop 22, and I think it's made things worse. I'm working on legislation right now here locally that should be statewide, where it's a question of whether it's preempted, to make sure that Uber and Lyft actually provides bathrooms for their workers. It's absolutely unacceptable that they don't. During the pandemic, I legislated to make sure that they provided gloves and masks and hand sanitizer and paid for bathroom breaks and washing their hands. These are very basic worker protections that should be available to all workers, including Uber and Lyft drivers. And it's incredibly unacceptable that we're unable to regulate in that way. So I would reform the process at the PUC. I would make sure that we aggressively challenge our ability to regulate and protect workers and also protect riders. This is about also the safety and rights of riders. And so those are things that I will focus on and fight for. I do support congestion pricing, and I think that obviously in the implementation of it here in San Francisco, we have a lot of work to do to work with communities to figure out some of the issues there. But I think over the long term, this is a direction that I do support. And I think I answered your question.
You don't have to go to time if you've answered it. David, you have 2 minutes.
I do support congestion pricing. I think it's something that makes sense. And in terms of Uber and Lyft, let me say that I definitely support the need to have better regulation. I think we need to support our gig workers, and that we need to make sure that people who work and they are workers at Uber or Lyft, that they get the benefits that come with being an employee and being a worker. But this goes to the point that I'm trying to make in this campaign, and I think what's resonating with many people in San Francisco, with voters in the 17th Assembly District. It's one thing to say what has been said. It's another thing to actually do it once you're elected. And that's the point here. The reason why I am not taking corporate money is because I believe that politicians say the right thing when it comes to regulating corporations, and when they're in office, they don't do the right thing because of the money that comes from those corporate interests. Who do you trust that's going to actually go and fight for you in Sacramento? And that's what this campaign is about. It's about making sure that the person who is selected to represent the 17th Assembly District is going to be beholden to no one but the residents of the 17th Assembly District. And I don't just talk about it, I've actually done it. And I'll give you the example with Airbnb. I actually passed the law that finally regulated short-term rentals in San Francisco. And Airbnb responded to that law by spending more than $1 million to defeat me in this state assembly. And I did not flinch. I did not take back what I was doing because it was the right thing. That's what we need with respect to these companies. Someone who is unafraid. And the proof is in the pudding and how you run your campaign. And that's why we're doing it the way we're doing it.
All right, David, thank you very much. That sounded like a direct challenge to me. Matt, you want a rebuttal? You can say no also if you'd like.
Sure. Well, David has run essentially his entire campaign on this one slogan that he himself has not lived up to. You can go to Cal Access and look who has donated to him. You can read a standard article that was done on this. Tens of thousands of dollars from corporate executives, from the biggest developers and lobbyists in our city. So we have big challenges, but I think it's a bit cynical that he is continuing to run his campaign on this entire slogan that he frankly has just not lived up to at all. The overwhelming majority of my support is from individuals and from labor.
All right, Matt,
I have not taken money from.
Thank you for that rebuttal. David, do you want a rebuttal to that rebuttal?
Let me respond because the SF Standard actually wrote a whole piece on this and found that I did not take a single corporate contribution. And what you have in Matt Haney is not only do you have tens of thousands of dollars, but you actually have $95,000 from people that oppose Medicare for all. And if you count the money that they're given to the independent expenditure on his behalf, it's close to 150,000. And so that's the difference, is that you have an individual who is taking money from the very people that are opposing the thing that he.
All right, David, thank you. I do appreciate that. I'm sure we'll get to some of this in our next section. That does close out our 4 moderated questions from our wonderful hosts here from the different neighborhood and business groups. However, we now have a bit of a spicy section. I'm really ready for this. This is our candidate to candidate questions. So just to remind you all, each candidate will have 2 separate opportunities to ask the other candidate a question. Candidates will have 30 seconds to ask their question. So please, brevity is king, please. And 2 minutes for responses. I am told we are allowed rebuttals during this, but let's not go back and forth with too many rebuttals. I'm just gonna allow 1 rebuttal in this so we can keep to time. Matt, if you've got a question for David, let's start with you.
Sure, thank you. Well, one of the things that I saw recently, speaking of headlines, is that New Mexico became the first state that I'm aware of that is offering free tuition to all of its residents, regardless of income or immigration status, for public higher education. This is something that I'm very excited about and would want to champion. And I want to ask David if that's something you're supportive of, and how do you think that we might work towards that goal here in California?
Well, I'm the product of public education and public schools. And throughout the campaign, I've talked about not only the need to better fund our K-12 system, but I believe that college should be free. And I think that we should begin with community college here in California. I know that the governor has talked about how they have close to made it, free, but I don't think that we're quite there yet. If we're going to continue to grow as the 5th largest economy in the country, in the world, we're going to have to invest in higher education. Education is a great equalizer, and I believe that we need to do better as a state. And if places like Ireland, who have a lot less money than California, can make college free, so should California.
All right, I didn't hear any challenges there, so no rebuttals needed, I would assume. David, feel free to ask your first question, Matt.
Well, I do have a question, because there is a proposal that is sort of floating out there, and it's quite frankly being put forward by some of Matt Haney's new political allies. This idea of allowing for-profit developers to build what they want, so long as they meet a certain set of requirements. That is looking to be on the ballot probably later this year. And I'm just wondering, Matt, do you support that proposal?
I haven't reviewed the proposal that you're referring to. I think I'm aware that there's something that's collecting signatures. There was a version of a housing charter amendment that came to the board that I was supportive of. I don't know if this one is identical to that. I do think that if a project meets a certain threshold of affordability, that we should have some streamlining involved with that. And so I'm supportive of that. I think it's also important that there are labor standards around that and other standards that are included. So I haven't taken a position on this particular proposal that I think is not in front of the board, but is circulating with signatures. But there is a version that focuses on some streamlining that was at the board that I was supportive of. I don't know if this one is identical or not. I've heard there are some differences.
All right. Not hearing any direct challenges there, unless David, you'd like to correct me. Matt?
I'm pulling from the head. I'm taking from you, Joe. I'm pulling from the headline. There was an article today, a column from Heather Knight that was about how we're losing many of our teachers in our public schools. Both David and I, we've worked for SFUSD in different capacities. And this is something that I'm very concerned about. I imagine you are as well. What can we do to better recruit and retain educators here in SFUSD and in our public schools?
Well, one thing that I did as a supervisor, and something that I think that we should do at the statewide level, is that I actually enacted legislation that provided protection for educators from eviction during the school year, during the academic year. We actually expanded it to include families. But quite frankly, I think that we need to increase teacher pay to attract people into this profession, and we need to address issues like housing. One of the things that I want to do through this housing bond that I've talked about is to put money on the table so that we actually have money to build teacher housing in places like San Francisco Unified. Quite frankly, the bond should go beyond teacher housing. It should be first responder housing, so that it's police officers, firefighters, nurses. San Francisco, God forbid, there is a natural disaster. Most of our firefighters and police officers live outside the city. They're going to have to cross a bridge to get to us to put out those fires and to help. And I think that puts us in a very challenging predicament. So I think that pay raise and more housing for teachers, I think that's something that's needed.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Last question, David.
I mean, Matt, I have to ask you this, I talked about the money that you received from the opponents of Medicare for All. Are you going to give that money? Why not give that money back? You know, these are individuals who are against single payer, and why take their money?
So I believe you're referring to the support I've received from dentists, from family physicians, from emergency room doctors. These are folks who did incredible, heroic work on the front lines during COVID, and I've worked with them on mental health, on addiction issues, and I plan to work closely with them on those issues. I disagree with them very openly around single payer healthcare. I have the support of the author of the bill. I have the support, as you do, of the sponsor, California Nurses Association. And so I can have money from the family emergency room doctors and tell them I disagree with them on single payer, which they're aware of, and also tell them that I want to make sure that they have adequate staffing so that when one of my constituents comes in with an emergency, that we have adequate support for them there. I think both things are possible. I've been very clear about where I stand on single payer, and you have the support of somebody like the head of CPMC. You know, these are folks who do not support single payer. So we're not going to agree with every single person or every single group that supports us. I don't think you would say you agree with the head of Maximus Real Estate who donated to you. You probably disagree with him on a number of things. I disagree with the doctors on single payer. I agree with them that we need to do a lot more to make sure we support the staffing within our mental health care system so that people get the care that they need right now. And I'm ready to go in and work with them on that.
Well, we
All right.
actually.
Thank you. Did you want a rebuttal, David?
Yeah.
Is that okay? All right. 30 seconds.
Well, on the Maximus contribution, we acknowledged that that was a mistake, and we actually returned it. And I think that what you said, Matt, unfortunately, is what has been said by all these politicians who got elected promising single payer. And when they got to Sacramento, they didn't deliver. And I believe that they didn't deliver because they got so much money from these folks. And I think that if you really believe that single payer and Medicare for all is what is needed, why would you take money from them? And that's the difference, I think.
All right, fellas. I said at the outset of this that we would not have rebuttals of rebuttals because we need to keep on moving. I know that there's been challenges and we could go all night, but we've got to get to these audience questions, and there's a fair amount of them. There, we won't be able to get to all of them because there's so many good questions. Thank you, everyone, from Bobby Coleman to Barry Durano and everyone else in here. First audience question, candidates, we are concerned about the deterioration of the quality of life in San Francisco. So if legislation came before you to further weaken vehicle muffler regulations, would you support that bill, or would you support the vast majority of your constituents, many of whom live on busy streets and just want a little peace and quiet? Please, let's see. Matt, let's start with you.
I agree. I think that on a whole number of issues, quality of life has deteriorated and needs a lot more support. It's why I offered to bring us for the first time a Department of Sanitation in San Francisco to clean up our streets and provide oversight around that. But there are other types of quality of life concerns, and noise is one of them. So I would definitely not support legislation that would lead to more noise in our neighborhoods. You may have seen that I recently had to deal with a rooster in the Tenderloin because of how loud it was. And noise is incredibly disruptive for residential neighborhoods, for families. And so I would definitely, on the whole range of quality of life things, from cleaning up our streets to making sure that we're not have loud cars or other things that keep people up and that really disturb the quality of life. Of course, that extends to things like safety as well. That would be something that I would prioritize, and I wouldn't support legislation that would make that worse.
David.
I mean, I think that we need to look at the quality of life in these neighborhoods. And one of the reasons, by the way, I don't support the idea of taking out the neighborhood voice from land use decisions and from development, is because I think that voice is important when it comes to issues like traffic, congestion, making sure that schools are properly funded. All of those voices should be heard. I also think that, issues around noise should also not be used to, perhaps silence some, people of color, mufflers, and some of those issues have been raised in some communities. I do think it's a balance, but again, the point here is that we as San Franciscans need to have a say in what happens in the day-to-day life of our respective neighborhoods. Hardy Milk, used to say, from what I hear, that San Francisco is a city of neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods need to have that voice.
All right. Thank you, David. Our next question asks, a little pointedly, I may rephrase it. The next question asks, as San Franciscans, will you commit to resisting the gerrymandering of SF districts supported by the allies of the current mayor? And I will rephrase that to say, where do you stand on the current redistricting now? There's a lot of folks pushing for 4D, a lot of folks pushing for 4B, a lot of different sides to cutting these maps. David, let's start with you.
Let me say this, I really hope that the task force takes the time to listen to these community concerns. I respect, Reverend Townsend, who I know is a part of that process, and I hope they take the time to listen. I really believe that what we have right now doesn't really reflect what's out there. And look at District 5, essentially a district that had the lowest percentage of population change, essentially being reconfigured in a way that is completely not recognizable. And what I hope people understand is that redistricting is not supposed to be about giving one political side an advantage over the other. It should really be done to give the neighborhoods accurate representation based on population change, and that is not happening right now. So I stand wholeheartedly with the community plan, and I hope that this task force listens to them and adopts it.
Thank you, David. Matt.
I think this is one where David and I have a lot of agreement. We were both out there on Saturday standing with the residents who were organizing for a change in the maps. In District 6, it's been very important to me that the Tenderloin and the South of Market stay together and that they stay in District 6. That has been a key part of my focus and my work around this. But I know that there are important considerations also for the other districts. For District 5, also, I know there are folks here from District 3 that have questions and concerns and focuses related to where those lines are, Russian Hill and other places. And I hope that the task force takes the time to listen very closely to you all as well. So this is something that thankfully is still being contested, and there's a huge rally that happened that I would have been at with community members around this this evening, and I'm sure David would have been there as well. And I really hope that we can do this in a way that keeps communities of interest together, that doesn't have massive levels of disruption, doesn't divide neighborhoods that have traditionally been connected. And I do think that there are ways to do that well and effectively, and that's what I will continue to support. And I hope that people will continue to speak out and to tell the task force how they feel about these things. And my hope is that there are some significant changes from the map that they're considering right now, and that gets us closer to a map that really keeps those neighborhoods together, unites communities of interest, and doesn't do such massive disruption in a way that I think would undermine the voices of many neighborhoods across our city.
All right. Thank you, Matt. And again, for folks just coming into that, it's the redistricting of the supervisorial district. So what neighborhoods vote for which district supervisor seat? Kind of a big deal happening right now. All right. Our third audience question. Would you support amending state, I'm sorry, pardon me, I skipped one. Do you support the repeal of the Ellis Act? Why or why not? Matt?
Yes, we have a situation right now where we know that there's an incredible amount of misuse of the Ellis Act around speculation. It leads to a lot of displacement in our city, particularly its impacts on San Francisco are very sharp. And there was an attempt to actually address the speculation aspect of it that was brought in front of the legislature that really shamefully didn't even go forward to a vote or a hearing. And I think that we need to first take steps to do things like that and then go even further than that. So yes, I do. And, I think that there have been efforts over the years to do this and it's been stopped, and it's really unacceptable and shameful. I am a renter. I am the only renter in this race. There are in Sacramento, less than 2% of legislators are renters, despite the fact that over half of Californians live in renter households. Of course, there's a room for voices of renters and homeowners, but there's a massive imbalance right now. And I think that impacts the policy making. Not only do you have a situation where there are very few renters, but you have a situation where many of the people who are legislators are landlords. And so they're expressing that perspective when we need to have the perspective of renters and people who are going to fight for tenants. I have defended people who have faced eviction in court. I've passed just cause eviction protections, which extends now to all tenants in San Francisco. That should be a state law. And so I will be a champion around addressing the Ellis Act, as well as the broader issues that tenants and renters are facing in our state.
Thank you, Matt. David, 2 minutes.
Thank you for that question, because I really think that this issue in many respects goes to the heart of this campaign. And it's not about who's the renter, and it's a question of who's going to be best for renters. And in this particular race, the landlords and the speculators that have abused the Ellis Act to evict people have chosen a side. We just had a rally earlier today where we had a number of community members that came out to denounce the realtors who have spent more than $360,000 against me to elect Supervisor Haney, because they know that I'm going to be the champion for renters in Sacramento. They have made a choice because they believe that they can trust Matt Haney to support their interests. That's what this campaign is about. And the reason why these speculators are doing everything they can to make sure that I do not get elected is because they know that if I'm in Sacramento, I'm going to not only talk about getting rid of the Ellis Act, I'm actually going to do it. And so I hope that renters in this race understand that the realtors are actually right in one sense. They send out these mailers saying the choice is clear. Yes, the choice is clear. I'm the candidate who's opposed by realtors, by landlords and developers. I'm the candidate who's supported by the Affordable Housing Alliance, by the San Francisco Tenants Union, and every tenants' rights organization is behind this campaign, my campaign, because they know that I'm the person who's going to fight for you if you're a renter in San Francisco. I hope you understand the importance of this vote, because it's a question of who is with you, and I'm with you, not with the realtors.
All right. Thank you, David. That is time. That sounds like a bit of a challenge, Matt, if you wanted to rebut. However, we do have a lot of audience questions. I'm sure they would love for us to move on, but the choice is yours.
I'll respect the audience.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Same thing as over and over again. So
Yeah. All right. So moving on to the next audience question. Would you support amending state laws to allow for commercial rent control? David.
Absolutely. I think that's another issue that we face, commercial rent control. And in fact, one of the things that I try to address as a supervisor without having commercial rent control was the issue of how do you keep businesses in San Francisco? And I'm the author of one of the most important pieces of legislation to support small businesses, which is the Legacy Business Program. And one of the reasons that we have to go to the ballot to pass that is because we wanted to allow for funding that provides a matching fund for those businesses, those small businesses that do not own their properties. And what was happening in places like Valencia, the Valencia corridor, is that you have these tech companies coming in, they could pay more. And so these landlords were basically ending their lease with these long-term businesses in favor of these, startups coming in. And the Legacy Business Program actually provided a matching fund so that the landlord could be competitive if a 10-year lease was given. So I believe that we need to address that issue. I believe that for small businesses, that is a matter of life and death for the business. More than half the businesses don't own their property, they rent the space. And so if we really want to keep San Francisco affordable, not only do we need, to protect as we have residential rent control, but we also need commercial rent control.
All right. Thank you, David. Matt, 2 minutes.
Absolutely. We should have a commercial rent control. We also need to be able to have commercial eviction protections. We were able to do some of that during the pandemic and use emergency powers, and I was closely involved with that and co-authored those efforts. And we need to be able to extend those types of rights for small businesses, really, who are struggling, who need to make sure that right now, in a month, a year, or whatever it is, they can have their rents jacked up at incredible rates, and they have no rights in that process. I think that's wrong. It hurts our neighborhoods, who should be able to protect their small businesses and the incredible contributions that they make to our neighborhoods. I also was very supportive of commercial vacancy taxes and those types of efforts. And even if we can't get commercial rent control in the short term, we have to be able to increase the rights and protections that small businesses have and the support they have. That it has to include, I would fight for more funding in our budget to deal with commercial rent debt. We still have a lot of small businesses that have huge amounts of debt and are really hanging on by a thread. That's something that I worked on for our nightlife and entertainment venues and music venues, to create a fund, a special fund for them to be able to access support. But we need to extend that. So these are things that I think that we need leadership on. I've been very closely working with our small businesses to make sure that they can stay, that they could survive during COVID, getting them support, making sure there are more grants, assistance for rent debt. And those are efforts that I will take, as well as pursuing commercial rent relief and stronger eviction protections for our small businesses.
All right, thank you, Matt. We have any challenges to one another? No, we're good. All right. Moving on, we have our last audience question. Definitely one that is applies to San Francisco. In June 2021, Governor Newsom signed the HIV and Aging Act, making older people living with HIV a community of greatest need in the state. Half of people in the U.S. living with HIV are over the age of 50, and in San Francisco, that number is far higher. The needs of this community, says our question asker, have gone overlooked for far too many years. How do you plan to see the needs of this aging community, which is only going to become larger and larger as medical science continues? How are you going to help them? Matt, let's start with you.
Well, it's one thing to sign that in the law. It's another thing to actually make it real in practice. And there are a number of things that we can do to support and provide for this community, particularly as they age. When I chaired the Budget and Finance Committee, the coalition, the HIV/AIDS Coalition, came to us, and I made sure that we funded all of the asks that they had. There are a range of things that we provided for, not only additional rental subsidies and vouchers to make sure that people can age in place and stay home and not have to fear displacement, but also increasing funding for mental health care and health access. These are things that we can provide at a local level, but also the state can fund. So making sure there are explicitly available housing that is built for this population, ensuring that there are vouchers available for housing for them, and making sure that we are addressing the full scope of health needs, both on the care itself for HIV/AIDS, but also for the other impacts that this disease can have, including on mental health and other types of needs. So this will be a priority for me. It has been during my time as supervisor. I represent a district where there are many survivors who live in my district and who are aging and who have found support from the city, particularly as the federal government has stepped back in some ways. And it's key that and critical that the state steps up and makes this commitment that they've made to make this group the highest priority actually real, with funding for building housing, with subsidies and vouchers, and with mental health and healthcare meeting the full needs of the population.
All right, thank you, Matt. David.
Thank you for that question. And I have to say, for me, the issue of the aging LGBTQ population and the needs of that community, including the needs of those who have HIV, is an issue that I've been working on for many years. When I was on the Board of Supervisors, and Scott Wiener and I we worked together and actually did a study that looked at the overall needs of this population, not only looking at the issue of HIV, but looking at issues of housing, people who were in retirement homes having to go back into the closet. But all of this points to something that I believe is really important, and I think it's important in this race. Representation matters. I appreciate that Supervisor Haney and so many of our straight allies have been very supportive of the LGBTQ community on so many different issues. But there is something to be said for having representation from these communities. And for the LGBTQ community, this seat has a long history of importance. This is the seat that Harvey Milk ran for, the seat that Carol Migden, Mark Leno, Tom Amiano held for many years. And the reason that they are supporting me, the reason why the BAR, which doesn't always, agree with my views, is supporting me, is because they see the need for LGBTQ representation in this day and time. To this day, you have LGBTQ people, especially LGBTQ people of color, that are being targeted. And having a voice from that community does make a difference. There is a reason why Scott Wiener has been fighting the fight on so many different issues that even our straight allies will not touch. That is the significance, the importance of this. And if elected, I will be the first queer person of color to represent San Francisco in the state legislature. It is time.
All right, David, thank you. That did sound like a bit of a direct challenge. Matt, did you want to rebut anything? No? All right. In that case, that was our last audience question. Thank you, gentlemen, for being so kind to our audience. And thank you, audience, for being such an intelligent question askers and fantastic civically minded people. In that case, we're going to have closing remarks. And because we just ended with you, David, let's start with you and then move on to Matt. 90 seconds.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Nice job, Joe. It's good to see you, Matt. This election is not about any one of the candidates. It is about you. And I am running a campaign that is not just about getting elected. We are going to get elected, but it's about changing the way we choose our leaders. Our political system is broken. I am running to change that system. That's why we're running corporate free. And the establishment in this city, and we saw the endorsement of Mayor Reed yesterday, is rallying behind Supervisor Haney because they want the status quo to continue. If you want change, if you want a government that is responsive to you and not the corporate interests, vote for me. It is time to have someone who is unafraid to take on the powers that be in Sacramento. That's what this campaign is about. I hope you join us at composforuss.com. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Matt, please, 90 seconds.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Nick. Thank you to the Telegraph Hill dwellers and the audience for those great questions and sticking through it with us to the end. And thank you, David, as well. It's good to see you. I have worked on the tough issues that our city is facing, and I've gotten results. I've gone headfirst to take on big corporate interest. I passed the overpaid executive tax, the first tax in the country that actually taxed corporations for their contribution to inequality, passed at a local level. These are things that I've taken on. I've also taken on bureaucrats who've been failing us. I passed, hopefully many of you voted, to create a Department of Sanitation and took on corruption and stood up for our residents to make sure people had access to vaccines and testing. I took on corporations like the gig companies to make sure that they protected their workers during the pandemic. I will fight and I will challenge the status quo and I will get results. That has been my track record of 15 years of public service in this city. I have never been a part of any status quo or any power structure or any of that. I've been about fighting for the residents who most need a champion. And that's what we need in Sacramento right now, when housing costs are out of control, when homelessness in our streets needs to get people inside, and other cities and counties need to do their part, when we need mental hospitals and accountability. This is what I'll fight for, and this is what I'll champion. And for the residents of District 3 and the neighborhoods of District 3, I live down the street. I know
Matt, thank you.
And I'll deliver.
Thank you, Matt, so much. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you to all the groups here, the Telegraph Hill dwellers and all, for having me as your moderator tonight. Again, Joe Fitzgerald Rodriguez. You can check out my work at kqed.org. You can email me when one of these folks is in office and you've got issues with one of them, email me, jrodriguez@kqed.org, and maybe we'll do a story on it. And please, I just wrote a piece last week I'm very proud of about both of these folks and their legislative records on the Board of Supervisors. Every law they've written, I read them and I wrote about them and I broke it down for you. Go to kqed.org on my author page. You can read all about these two candidates right there. Thank you again for having me. And Nick, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah. Well, hey, yeah, very big thank you to you, Joe, for moderating this debate. Joe, I think this was one of the best debates that we've had, certainly had the most audience participation, which is a testament to the candidates and, of course, this election. So thank you all. And again, big thank you to David Campos, Matt Haney for running in this election. We said this last time. My gosh, this is not easy, and we recognize the sacrifice that you are both making just by competing in this race to represent us in Sacramento. So thank you both very much. A final reminder that the election is Tuesday, April 19th. If you're voting by mail, you definitely will have received your ballot already. So if you haven't, might want to look into that. Probably best to vote in person. And of course, thank you again to all the sponsoring organizations. Please become a member if you're in any of these areas. And I wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you.